our smoky baked tempeh, first I just want to talk to you a bit about what tempeh is. So tempeh, as you can see here, is a soybean patty that is inoculated with a certain type of bacteria that helps to start break down the soybeans, which makes it a little bit easier for some of the nutrition to be released. It does give it a very unique and interesting flavor that may not be for everyone. And so I'm going to show you a couple tips on how to mellow the flavor a bit, but it's a great source of protein and it adds a lot more chewiness. It has a lot more texture. You know, for someone that's looking for plant-based proteins that aren't maybe as squishy as someone might say about tofu, something like that, this is completely in contrast. So it's much chewier, much firmer. And then because it has a stronger flavor, you can flavor it with stronger things. So one popular way to make tempeh is to make it reminiscent somewhat of bacony flavors. It certainly is never going to pass as bacon, but you can give it a lot of those flavors that someone might be missing if they're cutting back on that. So you can give it a smokiness, a savoriness, an umami sort of flavor, which is what we're going to try and bring out with our marinade. We'll also add some maple syrup since, you know, often bacon has kind of a mapley flavor. So we'll go ahead and start with our marinade, and then I'll explain how we can mellow out the flavor a bit and a few different cooking techniques, which will all be reflected in variations of the recipe. So, basically all the ingredients in the recipe except tempeh go in the marinade. It doesn't matter what order you put them in, but I'm dumping in the maple syrup, the tamari or soy sauce. I'm using a low sodium version to cut back on the salt a bit. There's a little bit of oil. That will help crisp it up a bit. If you decide to do the variation where you're frying it in a frying pan, you don't need to add that to the marinade. But if you're baking it in the oven like we'll do today, then since we're doing the roasting class, then we'll want to add that to add some crispness. A little apple cider vinegar helps balance out the flavor. Our tongues taste several flavors. They taste sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. So there's 5 main flavors. And it's good to have a sense of what you can add to different dishes to balance out one of those flavors if it's too strong or too pungent compared to what you want, or if something seems bland. So if something seems bland, often there's not enough of one or more of those flavors. So, you know, keeping in your repertoire, if something is kind of bland, you could add something that's a little bit acidic that will bring some tang. If it's too bitter, you know, having something that's sweet to add to it will balance that out. If it's too sour, having something sweet will also balance that out. Sometimes you want a meaty flavor and sometimes you don't. You know, if we're making something like this that is going to be our protein, our high protein item in a dish, then we often do want it to be a little bit meaty. And the soy sauce, the paprika that we're going to add in just a minute, and the sweetness from the maple syrup that will caramelize in the oven will bring some of that to the dish. So I'm going to take my paprika. That's going to give it some of that smoky flavor. If you wanted it to be really smoky, you could also add a few drops of something called liquid smoke, which you can buy in the seasoning, herb, spice section of your grocery store. That will add a more authentic smoky flavor. And then I'm going to add a little cayenne pepper for spice. So spice isn't necessarily one of those flavors that we mentioned, but often for anyone that really likes spicy food, we'll often include that as almost like a 6th flavor. So I'm just going to whisk this marinade together. The main thing you're aiming for is just to get that maple syrup really mixed in so it's not just sitting on the bottom. Just takes a second. All right, so that's all mixed together. In a minute, we're going to put our tempeh in there, but let's talk about how we're going to prepare this tempeh to go into our marinade. So often if you're in a typical grocery store, you're going to get tempeh that looks like this. It's about an 8-ounce block of tempeh. So that's, the recipe uses one of these, but you can certainly, it freezes well, you can certainly make multiple and just have to do this once to save yourself some time. Because I want it to be thin and crispy, I'm going to cut it in thin strips. So you can leave it in a big block like this and cut it in thin strips, or it's a little bit easier to manage if you cut it in half first and then cut it into thin strips. So I'm doing my claw here to keep my fingers safe, and I'll cut about an eighth inch strips. And you just walk your fingers back as you do that. Okay. Try and get them even if you can. They'll cook a lot more evenly that way. A little bit less fussy when you have them in the oven if you do it that way. Okay, so we have our tempeh sliced into these 1/8 of an inch or so strips. And now, the longer that you leave them in the marinade, the more flavor they'll soak up. You can stick them directly in the marinade. If you don't mind the flavor of tempeh, you like it, you don't mind that little bit of bitterness that's there, I'm going to show you one trick to mellow that out if you're new to tempeh or that's off-putting to you at all. and we will add to the marinade in just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and heat up my burner here. I have about a 1/2 inch of water in my pan. That's all. We're just going to blanch this. So blanching is a technique where you have water heated up to boiling, and then you put a food in it just for a couple of minutes. Often it's a cooking technique that's used with vegetables. And why you might use that with vegetables is, say if you're at a gathering or a nice restaurant and you've had those like really bright green, crisp, not totally raw, but also not totally cooked pieces of broccoli or green bean or whatnot. What they've done is they've blanched it. So they've actually had a big pot of boiling water, dumped the vegetables in. Often it's quite salted. Otherwise the color will leach out into the water. So you have salted boiling water, dunk your vegetable in there for a minute or two, then put it in an ice bath, which is just water mixed with ice in a bowl. And that will make it so that it seals in that bright color, locks in some of the flavor, and then you can use it in place of totally raw vegetables. It does mellow out the flavor a bit too, just like what we're going to do with the tempeh. So just waiting, might as well give you some cooking tips while we wait for things to heat up, right? So we just want this to come to start to bubble, come to a simmer. If you have it at a rolling boil, it's actually going to break up your tempeh. It might start to fall apart. Having, one of these spatulas that doesn't have a big space in it is also nice. Tempeh, as it gets blanched or simmered in the water, will get a lot more fragile than it is right now. This is pretty easy to deal with. It's not going to fall apart. After you simmer it, it does become a little more temperamental. And then I'm going to put out a towel. I'm going to dry off my tempeh when it's done blanching, because if we put it where it has a lot of water in it after being here into the marinade, it's not really going to soak up much. So you're going to get maximum soaking up if you put it in there dry without blanching it. So it'll have a lot stronger flavor. It will have a mellower flavor if we blanch it first, but we want to make sure to dry it so we get some flavor. And again, just try it a couple different ways, see how you like it. All right, so now we're going to turn this down. We don't really want it to be much more bubbly than that. And you just want to lay these in there. They don't stick together and they're not going to stick to the bottom of the pan with the water in there, so put them in. We're just going to do this for a minute or two. If you leave it too long, it'll just turn into a bunch of beans floating around. You won't be able to do much with it. Okay, so we've been blanching our tempeh for a couple of minutes here. I'm going to turn off the heat and then start to remove it from the pan. And I will arrange it on the towel so I can easily fold over the top and just pat it dry. If you're doing this with a regular towel and not a paper towel, make sure it's one that doesn't give off a lot of lint. Otherwise you'll end up with lint in your food. So you don't want to use like a bath towel or hand towel for your bathroom. It won't work well. You want to get these out of here fairly quickly. The longer they sit in that water, the more they'll start to fall apart. If you're not sure how long to put them in there, undercooking is always a safer bet than overcooking. All right. Just going to gently pat that dry. You could use the same technique with a paper towel if you're doing, any sort of food where you might be more concerned about getting the water off, but you would be concerned a bit more about foodborne illness. So if you were doing like chicken or fish or something, you might want to pat it dry, but maybe use a paper towel or something that you can get rid of. All right, so these are quite dry, so I'm just going to put these in the marinade. Ideally trying to make sure that there's as much contact as possible of the pieces in the marinade, with the marinade, I should say. And then I'm going to allow them to sit for at least 15 minutes, and then about halfway through I'll flip it over so that the other side can soak it up as well. So even before I let this rest, I'm going to just flip it over just so that each side can have at least a little bit on there. We'll still want to flip halfway through, but that will allow a little bit to start permeating that top portion, so we're not having any wasted time with this marinade. Unlike you would do with, say, red meat or something, with plant proteins and plant foods, you don't want to marinate them for really extended periods of time. You know, for red meat, you might do 6 to 8 hours. For chicken, you might do 3 to 4. For fish, you might do 45 minutes to an hour. You want to aim for marinating vegetable-based proteins kind of like you would fish. You know, too long and they'll, some of them will start to fall apart. Tofu is pretty forgiving though. You can certainly put that in marinade overnight. In a few minutes, I will show you how we will prepare it to go in the oven. Our tempeh is now done marinating. I've had a couple containers marinating, have tossed it all together here for the sake of showing you how to get it onto the pan, and then we'll get it in the oven, and then that's our last step for this. So there's a little bit less marinade in the pan. I know that's hard to see on the video here, but you can definitely see, looking closely, that the tempeh has really been permeated with that marinade. And so this is the point where I'm just going to lay it in a single layer on the pan. So again, we're roasting, so we want to make sure that there's room between. We have some nice dry heat. We want to get a little caramelization. If you pile it all up together, it will just be like it will not have any of that caramelization. I guarantee this is not as tasty when the caramelization doesn't happen. If you had overcooked your tempeh, at this point, if you're trying to move it and it's falling apart, that's just a sign that if you did do the blanching step, that you had over blanched it. And so just next time, don't do that. Even if it's falling apart, just make sure it's spread out. There's just an even layer. Those little bits will crisp up. They're good replacement for bacon bits and something. You know, unless you really burn something to a crisp or add the wrong ingredient when it really can't go into something, most mistakes that you make are salvageable. So just try not to freak out. You know, there's been some really famous culinary creations that are a mistake, like chocolate lava cake is just undercooked chocolate cake. But, you know, just be confident, give your mistakes a new name and pretend like it was intentional and you'll be all set. Want to make sure not to put a lot of extra marinade. Again, that extra moisture is going to prevent it from crisping up. And then if you do have a convection oven, this is a really nice time to use it. Having that extra air blowing over this is going to really benefit this in terms of crisping. This one's a little bit more temperamental in terms of how likely it is to crisp or not. So definitely don't crowd the pan. And then if you don't have a convection oven, then just make sure that your oven is all the way up to temperature. So, you know, look at the recipe, preheat the oven, make sure the temperature is all the way up. It's helpful to have an oven thermometer if you're not sure of the temperature of your oven, because sometimes it's not accurate. And then you know when you've preheated it or not. And ovens can take a really widely varying amount of time to heat up. So now I will go ahead and transfer our smoky baked tempeh to the oven. So I think it's about time to check on our tempeh. We're going to go check on that in the oven. We definitely have some crispness. Let me pull this out so you can see it. So I'm going to flip this over and check it. Yeah, it's got a really nice, it's like nice and caramelized on the back. That's really what we're aiming for. And you know, I was using convection on the oven, so there was enough air blowing over the top that I didn't really need to flip it partway through. If you're baking it at a regular bake setting in the oven, about halfway through you'll want to flip it over. But we can go ahead and just dish this up. This isn't really anything that's meant to be eaten on its own. It's really meant to be, you know, put into, say, a sandwich or a salad or one of our bowls. And you don't have to flavor tempeh with this particular seasoning. You can really do it with, you know, anything else that strikes you. And one other alternative way to cook this, if you don't want to heat up your house or heat up the oven, is that you could have a skillet with, I would recommend a nonstick skillet with a little bit of oil, crisp it up just like you would cook, you know, kind of aiming for what you would do when you were cooking bacon, crisp it up in the pan and you could eat it that way. So that's another way that you could use the same recipe, but just pausing, cooking it in a skillet at the time where we previously put it in the oven when we were demonstrating it for you today. So here is our smoky baked tempeh, ready to go in whatever you are interested in having it in.